but I'm really interested in how well-being can support sustainable high performance, particularly in very demanding workplaces. Over the years, I've had the privilege to work in a wide variety of very demanding contexts, with Formula One teams, as you just heard, with some Fortune 500 companies as well. But you can think about a lot of the work and the research that I do as sitting at the intersection between 4 different topics. The first topic is leadership. The second topic is well-being. The third is performance. And the fourth is the future of work. And we're going to touch on each of those topics during the next 45 minutes or so. Some of the sports that I've worked in have provided some really helpful lessons that I think we can draw from and apply in a workplace context. I actually used to be a full-time racing cyclist many years ago. That career didn't work out. I went back to university. I studied sports science. Eventually, like many failed athletes, I became a coach. And I worked with some elite and professional riders, but most of my clients were business people. They had very demanding jobs in London, where I was based at the time. They were working 80 hours a week or sometimes more as finance professionals, as technology workers, as management consultants. And for some reason, outside of working those 80 hours a week, they decided to go and race for 180 kilometers at the weekend. But I realized that unless I could account for the cognitive load associated with their working life, I couldn't plan their physical performance effectively. And that really sparked my curiosity. I started to try and understand how to measure and understand the load associated with knowledge work. That's work where we think for a living. And I was so fascinated by that world that in the end I went back to university again. I ended up doing my PhD looking at the relationship between well-being and performance in very demanding workplaces. I've also had the privilege to work in some really interesting sports like alpine skiing, as well as in motorsport. I've worked across all categories in motorsport, all the big categories, from Formula 4, 3, 2, also in Formula 1, even a little bit in Formula E, and I'm aware that Jaguar has done very, very well in that series over the last couple of years. But today I am going to share some lessons from Formula 1, because I think there's some really practical things that we can take away that might help us in our work life too. Because as you'll know very well, if you follow Formula 1, while you see the driver on the track, Formula 1 really is an interesting combination of kind of a sport, a business, a software company, a technology company, a precision engineering company, likely with many similarities to the types of roles that I'm sure many of you are involved in. So before we get started today, I'd like you to use your imagination. I'd like you to imagine that you are on the starting grid of a Formula 1 Grand Prix, about 15 minutes before the start. If you've watched something like Drive to Survive on Netflix, or maybe you've been to a Grand Prix, you have a good sense of what this looks like. But if you haven't, just imagine that you're standing on the grid. At this point, you're kind of free to mill around. You've got that precious pass that means that you're able to be there on the grid. There's lots of people trying to look important at this point. Celebrities with big sunglasses. Everyone wants to look like they're really supposed to be there. But 15 minutes before the start of the Grand Prix, an alarm sounds. This means all the non-essential personnel have to leave the grid. So you find out who's really supposed to be there. So 15 minutes before the start, that alarm sounds, you are left. Imagine you're sitting in your Formula 1 car. You are the driver. At this point, you're surrounded by mechanics, engineers, who begin a startup sequence on the car. Once that startup sequence starts to come to an end, another alarm sounds just 1 minute before the beginning of the race. And at this point, those engineers, those mechanics, have 45 seconds to get off the grid and back to the pit wall. So they rush off, and you'll see them pushing trolleys and tyres and all kinds of pieces of equipment. So 15 seconds before the start of the race, it's just you, the driver, behind the wheel of the car. But you know that you're ready. And at this point, your attention is drawn to the lights on a starting gantry. They turn green. And this signals the start of a formation lap. So imagine that you pull away from your position on the grid. You begin a carefully orchestrated series of acceleration maneuvers, braking, turns, all designed to get the tyres and the brakes up to an optimum operating temperature. At the end of that formation lap, you find your position on the grid again. Now is the time. Once more, your attention is drawn to those lights on the starting gantry. The race director hands over control to an automated start sequence. And those lights begin to illuminate 1, 2, 3, 4. Your heart rate is increasing. You're gripping the steering wheel. Your reactions are tuned to respond any moment because you know that after that 5th light goes out, the race will begin. But you don't know how long those lights are going to stay up for. It's actually a random time interval. So you focus with precision on the edge of your seat, waiting for that race to begin, because when those 5 lights go out, that race is on. In many ways, I think Formula One provides a great example of a concept which is sometimes described as bias for action. Formula One is bias for action in action. You might have heard of bias for action before. Perhaps it's a term that you're familiar with. It's used in many businesses. But I often think about bias for action in the context of 3 components. The first, it means we're decisive and focused. Second, it means that we're proactive and that we're resistant to procrastination. Thirdly, it means we're empowered to act. We're not fearful. But how decisive and focused do you feel in your average workday? According to some data, we're interrupted once every 11 minutes. It then takes 23 minutes to get back up to speed on the original task. Sound familiar? How proactive are we? The average worker, according to some data, procrastinates for about 2.2 hours per day. I'm sure no one here does that, but maybe, perhaps you know someone who does. Do you feel empowered? According to some other research, 40% of workers say that they worry about making mistakes for most of the day. But my argument is I don't believe it has to be this way. And I'm going to share some practical tools that might help us to transform our bias for action and express some of those characteristics. In part 1, we're going to talk about becoming more decisive and focused. In part 2, we'll talk about boosting proactivity and resisting procrastination. And in part 3, we're going to talk about empowering action, moving away from some of that fearfulness, that fear of making mistakes that sometimes we all struggle with. But let's get into the first section. How can we increase our decisiveness and focus? Well, how many people here have done a sport like cycling or running or swimming? Anyone who's done that kind of sport, or maybe knows someone who does, might be familiar with this idea of training zones. These are intensity zones that some people might measure with a heart rate monitor, sometimes a technical piece of equipment called a power meter. But essentially, it enables you to measure the intensity of physical effort. Now, I'd like you to imagine for a moment that you could apply a similar method to measuring intensity in knowledge work. And if you were to do that, you could use this metaphor that I describe as cognitive gears. Cognitive gears are kind of like intensity zones for mental cognitive work in a similar way that we might think about heart rate zones for running, swimming, or cycling. So you can imagine that we can divide these intensity zones into 3. There is a high cognitive gear, and that is characterized by deliberate focus and efficient work on our most impactful, priority-driven tasks, the work that really matters most. Secondly, there's a middle cognitive gear. That's characterized by a bit of procrastination, some task switching, some meetings, doing emails. Then there is a low cognitive gear. This is about proactive recovery, effective breaks, the time that we might need to spend taking a step back so that then we can step forward further. But if I was to ask you now, where do you spend most of your average day? Most people, if they're honest, probably spend more time than they'd like to stuck in that cognitive middle gear. A middle gear that is all too often characterized by procrastination, task switching, meetings, and email. See, the problem is there is a battle for our attention. There's a really interesting researcher, she's called Gloria Mark, Professor Gloria Mark, and she's been capturing data on people's attention spans for over 20 years now. 20 years ago, the average attention span was about 2.5 minutes. You can see on the screen how much that has eroded. Today, the average attention span is down to 47 seconds. See, one of the challenges I think we have as knowledge workers is that we've got access to more information than ever before. But while we have this wealth of information, Unfortunately, it means that all too often we have a poverty of attention. You know, one of my contentions is that we need to stop throwing around our attention like it's loose change, and instead recognize that it's a precious resource that needs to be invested, which needs to be invested and thought about carefully in terms of how we allocate it, when and where. And I think many of us would find that that's in stark contrast to how we approach the average day. In practice, this means that many of us need to find a way to work smarter. And I think that could begin by increasing the quality of our focused effort where it's going to have the greatest impact. Secondly, we're never going to get rid of that middle cognitive gear time, but we might be able to reduce a bit of procrastination and inefficiency. And we're going to talk about how to do that later in the presentation. And finally, spend a bit more time in that low cognitive gear, which means recovering proactively, taking effective breaks, maybe finding ways to break up some of those back-to-back meetings that many of us find we're stuck in for much of the day. But this process might begin by identifying something called your chronotype. Chronotype simply describes our tendency towards morningness or eveningness, or maybe if we're somewhere in the middle. So how many people here would describe themselves as a strong morning type? You generally feel at your best in the morning. Yeah, we've got a few. How many people here are more of a strong evening type? You feel at your best later in the day. A few of those. And how many people are somewhere in between? Yeah, not many. How many people have ever asked that question of their team? Have you got any idea whether your team members are stronger morning types or evening types? I encourage you to ask that question, because we each have a tendency, a lot of it's genetically governed, to be at our best at different times in the day. You can find this out by very sophisticated tests, but that simple question, when do you feel at your best? Maybe ask your teams, maybe ask your friends and family too, is quite powerful. You see, cognitive performance, regardless of whether we're a morning type, an evening type, or somewhere in between, varies by about 20% during the average day. If you're an early bird, a morning type, it's likely that you experience this variation as a peak, followed by a valley, and then you experience a rebound later in the day. If you're more of an evening type, you probably experience this in reverse. You start the day with this rebound, your valley comes in the middle of the day, and then your peak period, when you feel at your best, is likely to come much later in the day, even into the evening. In practice, this means that some parts of the day are better or less well suited to different types of work. And we can use that, we can put it into practice based on something called chrono-working. Chrono-working describes adapting working patterns to those tendencies. And those tendencies towards morningness or eveningness are actually driven by our body clock, by our circadian rhythm. So you can think about applying this by paying attention to when you feel at your best, that peak period in your day, and trying to schedule some of that high cognitive gear time, that really focused work, that high priority work where you can have the biggest impact, to coincide with the peak period of your day. Secondly, in that valley, that part of the day where naturally your energy level is lower, take an effective break. It used to be called a lunch break. I think that's gone extinct in many places now, unfortunately. But then later in the day, the rebound, when your energy starts to come back, but you're not quite as sharp as during that peak period of your day, that's a great opportunity for scheduling meetings, switching tasks, emails, the little jobs that just need to get done. Now, I recognize that we might not have complete autonomy over our time. It's not possible to schedule this type of work in line with your preference every day. But could you do it maybe slightly more than you do at the moment? Pay a bit more attention to those peak periods, particularly when you're working from home, for example, if anybody does that. It might be that you can schedule some of that high gear work to coincide with the peak in your day, and maybe shove some of those meetings into parts of the day when you're a bit more distracted anyway. Now, unfortunately, 68% of people say that they don't have enough uninterrupted focus time during the average work day. I think that's probably something that many of us can relate to. So what can we do? Well, we might find the answer in a slightly unusual location, in the kitchen of a young Italian called Francesco Cirillo in the 1980s. Young Francesco was sitting in his kitchen. He was a university student at this time, and he was trying to study for his final exams. He was a diligent student. He'd committed to block out 3 hours to focus. So he set himself up in his mother's kitchen. He got his books out in front of him, and he sat down. He thought, I've got to get going. But this 3-hour period felt overwhelming. He thought, how am I going to maintain my attention for this block of time? So he had the bright idea, instead of trying to focus for 3 hours in one block, to break it up into smaller chunks. However, he wasn't wearing a watch. He needed some kind of timer. So he looked around his kitchen, and he found a cooking timer. Just so happened this cooking timer could be set to 25 minutes, and it was shaped like a tomato. So he twisted it, set it for 25 minutes, and broke that 3-hour period into 25-minute chunks of focus, and he gave himself a 5-minute break in between. Now, if anyone here speaks Italian, you might know that the Italian word for tomato is pomodoro. And so the Pomodoro technique, as it's become known, is now one of the most popular productivity methods across the world. It's been used by students and professionals, probably anywhere you can imagine. And it simply involves dividing your high cognitive gear period into 25-minute blocks of focus with 5 minutes of recovery, which is a huge contrast to being interrupted once every 11 minutes, as many of us already are. Now, they did a study across 5 industrial sectors in the US, and it suggests that restructuring knowledge workers' time to include dedicated periods of focus could be worth $468 billion to those 5 sectors. And I think there's a good chance that for many people here as well, and for JLR more broadly, you could experience benefits individually and at an organizational level by just restructuring your time, maybe even just 1 or 2 days a week, to facilitate greater focus. Secondly, I want to talk about this cognitive middle gear. How can we boost proactivity? How can we resist the procrastination that unfortunately many of us do struggle with? We can gather all kinds of interesting data from workplace software. This is something that I did in my academic research, but also in some of the consulting that I do. But there's some data from other researchers as well that suggests that 70% of our emails are opened within 6 seconds of receiving them. Sound familiar? I think I'm probably guilty of that a lot of the time. Well, according to some other research, 42% of people admit to using email in the bathroom. Now, I've never done that, obviously. I'm sure no one has here. Maybe you know someone. Maybe the person sitting next to you has. But overall, it's pretty clear that the more time we spend on email, the lower our productivity and the higher our stress. So I'd like to share with you what's called 5 email super actions, because we've got a huge amount of data on how we use email now. And recently, some researchers synthesized the previous 25 years of research on how to use email effectively, and they consolidated it into these 5 email super actions. And I'd encourage you to consider these actions and maybe think about whether you could run an experiment, perhaps individually, perhaps in your team, and see what effect it has. The first email super action is to reconsider. Rethink your promises, whether they're explicit or implicit promises, to respond rapidly. Now, for some reason, we've fallen into this trap of using email and also sometimes other communication tools as forms of like instant messaging. And we've assumed that we're all going to respond immediately to messages or in very, very short time periods. But that's not always the case. Sometimes I think there is this unnecessary pressure to respond rapidly. Sometimes there are business critical reasons people really need a fast response. But very often we respond to emails quickly, sometimes as a kind of a form of procrastination to distract us from another piece of work that's maybe difficult to do, for example. So could you reconsider those explicit or implicit promises to respond rapidly? And related to that, you might need to clarify and set expectations about what's realistic, perhaps with an email signature. So for example, some people find that they can say, you can expect an email reply from me within 24 hours. If you need to contact me urgently, here's another communication channel that you can use. Perhaps you include a phone number, for example, or another communication channel. So reset expectations, clarify those expectations. Thirdly, schedule. Now again, I recognize there's probably particular points in perhaps the year or in different cycles where it's really important to respond rapidly to email. But a lot of the time, we'd probably benefit by batching email use to specific parts of the day rather than just interweaving it through everything that we do, so that we facilitate focus rather than constant distraction. Related to that, when you're in that high cognitive gear period in particular, that focus period, consider switching off your notifications. You could do an experiment. During an average work day, see what happens if you check in your email once per hour versus as often as possible. You'd be amazed at the effect that can have, not only on increasing focus, but also on improving well-being by reducing some of that underlying stress, that sense that we've got to reply to everything as soon as it arrives. And finally, particularly when you're in that high gear period, consider getting your phone and putting it out of sight. There's some really interesting research that demonstrates how powerful these phones are. We always anticipate something new arriving on these devices. They're a continuous stream of novelty. And actually our brain secretes dopamine, this kind of reward-based neurotransmitter, in anticipation of finding something new. Now, that new thing might even be bad news. It might be an email that we're concerned about. But we know that there is an endless stream of novelty right at our fingertips. And as a result of that, whenever our phone is in our vicinity, part of our attention is drawn to it. So they did a really interesting study, and they looked at the effect of what happened when people put the phone out of sight. They actually put it in another room. And what they found was that leaving your smartphone in another room boosted cognitive performance by about 10%. That's quite significant. So imagine you're working from home, you're in that high cognitive gear period, do an experiment. Consider taking that phone and putting it in another room. You might be surprised at the positive effect that has. Together, if you were to apply these different communication efficiency techniques, these 5 email super actions, putting your phone out of sight when you don't need it, some evidence indicates that could save each person in this room 180 hours per year. And what could you do with those 180 hours? Well, there might be business benefits in terms of working on some of those critical tasks. It might also mean you've got a bit more time to free up to invest in your well-being. Perhaps you can take an effective break. Maybe you can get a bit more sleep, a topic we'll talk about in a moment. Maybe you've got some time to invest in other things that you care about. But it's not just email, is it, that's causing the problems, unfortunately. What else could it be? Well, I'm sure you're not alone in noticing that the number of meetings that we've had seems to have increased substantially. Again, if you extract workplace data, there's some evidence that suggests that the number of weekly meetings booked in people's calendars has increased by 153% in the last couple of years. According to some other research, most of us would like to decline about 1/3 of the email invitations that we receive. However, because of organizational norms and expectations, people only decline half that many. Excessive meetings also create bottlenecks. Sometimes they don't give people the opportunity to make decisions themselves. Sometimes it's more likely to stop people from growing in their role. Sometimes people just have a meeting because they haven't really thought about doing some of the thinking or making a decision themselves. The bottom line is, I think many of us will probably relate to the experience that we have been part of way too many meetings that could have been replaced with a single, well-worded email. Right? Also, sometimes we use meetings as a kind of procrastination. We feel like we're busy, we feel like we're doing something meaningful, but it's important to remember that busyness is not bias for action. I think many of us probably need to disrupt our way of working, rethink some of these meeting norms, and refocus on quality over quantity. In practice, I've got some very practical things that you can put into place that might help you to streamline your meeting calendar and get rid of some of those unnecessary meetings. The first is to assess. Many of us have these kind of recurring meetings in our calendar that are just there because they've always been there. So I encourage you to do a kind of meeting audit. Take a look at your calendar, look for those recurring meetings, and reflect on whether they really need to be there, because there's probably some that you can get rid of. And be ruthless. If you've got the autonomy to do it, do an experiment for 4 to 6 weeks. Get rid of those recurring low-value meetings and see what happens. Because if those meetings are really needed, then you can always put them back in. But very often, we have meetings there that don't really need to be there, that could have been arranged more spontaneously, rather than taking chunks of people's time every week. Secondly, when you found those low-value meetings, eliminate them. You don't need to do it forever, but I would encourage you to give it a go. Thirdly, reduce. The standing meetings that are left, again, do an experiment. If you've got a standing weekly meeting, shift it to fortnightly. If you've got a standing fortnightly meeting, shift it to monthly. You don't need to do that forever, But you could run an experiment, and many people find that it makes no difference at all. And as a result, people rescue time perhaps for focus, or maybe for proactive recovery. Finally, shorten. Very often we have default 60-minute meetings or 30-minute meetings. And again, do an experiment for 4 to 6 weeks. By default, shift your 60-minute meetings to 30, your 30-minute meetings to 15. Most people find that when they do that, it creates an incentive to just get on with it, to get the meeting done. It eliminates some of the fluff, it frees people's time for focus or proactive rest. You also, though, need to be aware of a particular type of worker who unfortunately pervades the workplace. This worker is called the meeting maker. Are you a meeting maker? Maybe you're sitting next to a meeting maker. According to some research, just 5% of employees create 60% of meetings. Beware the meeting maker. So if you think you might be a meeting maker, or maybe you know one, this next slide, the flowchart that I'm going to share with you, is going to be very helpful, because it's a simple tool that you can use to decide whether a meeting is really required. I can see a few people getting their phones out. Feel free to take a picture of this slide. The first question to ask yourself, or to encourage the meeting maker that you know to ask themselves, is this: have I thought through the situation? So often people schedule meetings as a way to think about something, when really they should have done some of that thinking independently before they put some time on your calendar. Secondly, get people to really consider, do they need outside input to make progress? Again, very often people default to having a meeting rather than taking some time to think themselves and realizing that they can progress without getting your input, certainly not in real time. Thirdly, do you need a real-time conversation to take that item forward? Perhaps not. Perhaps it could have just been an email or a chat, for example. Again, not needing 15, 30, 60 minutes in your calendar. Fourthly, get people to think about the mode of communication. Does it need to be face-to-face? Again, perhaps it could be virtual, a video call, or even some kind of instant messaging. If people answer yes to each of those 4 questions, then it is time to schedule a meeting. However, most importantly, get the meeting maker to prepare appropriately for the meeting. And in practice, this means having a clear agenda. What do you want to achieve out of the meeting? If there's any materials required or a pre-read, get them to attach those materials to the meeting invitation, so that once you get into the meeting, which ideally should be a bit shorter than before, there's a really clear idea about what you are trying to achieve. When people try and put this into practice, they often find that their meeting calendar is significantly streamlined. They get a lot more time back, and the meetings that they do have are quality. Real work gets done, because so much of that thinking and preparation has already been done in advance. There was 76 companies decided to try and put some of these ideas into practice. They were able to reduce the number of meetings, on average across the organization, by 20%. Associated with that, they saw a 26% reduction in stress. Not only that, productivity increased by 35%. At the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that I'm very interested in the relationship between well-being and performance. All too often, we feel like well-being and performance are in conflict with each other, but this is a great example that well-being and performance can be entirely complementary. I'd also like to talk about how we can prioritize well-being in the average day, though. This begins sometimes by recognizing that to step forward, we actually need to take a step back first. But proactive recovery, I'd argue, actually doesn't start in the day. It begins the night before. It begins with adequate quality sleep. Now, for most people, this means a minimum of 7 hours of sleep, I'm afraid to say. I know some of us might struggle to achieve that, but the evidence is pretty overwhelming that 7 hours represents the threshold. Some people need a bit more than that. But I'd encourage you, if you're not sleeping for 7 hours per night, at least 7 hours, try to just nudge your average sleep towards that. You might be surprised at the benefits that you experience. And even in the highest performing organizations that I've worked with, I consistently see, and there's various other forms of evidence that support this, that there's a direct link between not sleeping enough and lower cognitive performance. Consistently, the shortest nights of sleep precede the lowest cognitive performance. And these data are taken from some of the world's top performing organizations that I've worked with. We also see decreases in performance related to some of the capabilities that are likely to be key sources of competitive advantage for organizations like JLR. For example, when we don't sleep enough, we sleep fewer than 7 hours, problem-solving ability decreases by over 60%. There's also an effect on our teams. It's not just about our own performance and well-being. There was some interesting data gathered from wearable devices combined with some other data sources that demonstrated that when leaders are carrying a high level of sleep debt, this means when leaders haven't slept enough, their teams report lower psychological safety. This is very likely because when we don't sleep enough, our emotional processing is impaired. Now, some people have looked into this in depth, and they would argue that sleep is so critical for emotional processing that we should characterize it as nighttime therapy. So it's not just your sleep for your well-being, it also has a direct impact on your teams too. But in terms of performance, if you were to look at the data overall, it seems that if you were to sleep for 6 hours per night for 2 weeks, you would experience declines in cognitive performance equivalent to dropping 15 IQ points. That's about the same as going an entire night without sleep. The problem is that for many of us, this decrease in cognitive performance has just kind of become a new normal. We don't really notice the effects. And what I see in high-performing organizations like JLR is people still get the job done, they still hit those targets, but they often have to work a lot harder to achieve them than they otherwise would if they'd been able to sleep more adequately to get closer to that 7-hour threshold, or perhaps even a bit more if they need to. Now, I don't have a huge amount of time to talk about sleep. I could go on and do an entire session about it, but I did want to share these 10 top tips for improving your sleep. Please feel free to take a picture of the slides, and they might be helpful, and feel free to share them with people as well. Now, the first tip is about temperature. Now, very often, our bedroom environment is warmer than it should be for optimal sleep. Ideally, it should feel a little bit cool when we get into bed. And in practice, this means having a room temperature around 18 degrees centigrade. Related to that, we want to choose bedding and clothing that's going to minimize the chances of overheating. One of the most helpful things that we can do for ensuring that we get adequate quality sleep is to have a regular sleep and wake time. Now, I'd argue that adults need bedtimes too. There was a recent large body of work reviewed by a group of sleep experts as part of kind of a consensus-making statement, and their consensus statement was that sleep regularity, the consistency of our sleep and wake times, could be almost as important as sleep duration. Now, I recognize this isn't always possible, but if you can, could you make your sleep and wake times a bit more regular than they are at the moment? How many people here enjoy caffeine? Me. We all love it, don't we? About 80% of the world consume caffeine in one form or another. Unfortunately, caffeine has quite a long half-life. So for the average person, it takes about 6 hours for caffeine to reach 50% of its concentration post-consumption and absorption in your bloodstream. Now, that half-life varies. It's genetically determined for the most part. It can vary between as short as 1 hour up to 9 hours. But in practice, this means that for most people, you can have a few coffees in the morning. If you don't stop early enough, there can still be enough caffeine hanging around at the end of the day to interfere with your sleep. So I encourage you to do an experiment again. Stop caffeine after midday for a week and see what effect you notice on your sleep. And many people find that stopping caffeine after midday has a really positive effect on their sleep, and they hadn't realized previously how harmful it was in terms of increasing the time it took to get to sleep, maybe disrupting their sleep as well. So humour me, give it a go. Hopefully you'll be surprised by the benefits. You might have heard people talk about how dangerous devices are. Don't look at your smartphone when you're in bed, for example, and don't look at it in the evening. And they've kind of got a point. You might have heard some podcasters say, the blue light from the screens is interfering with melatonin production. It's going to destroy your sleep. Well, it turns out that the relationship isn't quite as simple as that. It turns out that the light from your screen is only really harmful if you've been in a very dull environment during the day. It seems that there's a strong contrast effect. So if you've had enough bright light during the day, the blue light from these screens doesn't seem to interfere so much. Even then, it seems that the biggest factor is actually potentially the time we spend on the devices displacing time for sleep. So we're kind of procrastinating, we should just go to bed. And also, if we're looking at content that stresses us out, like you're reading and replying to emails, that could interfere with sleep. If you're just using your phone to kind of watch something on Netflix that's relaxing, that's fun, the evidence would indicate it's maybe not a massive problem, providing you're not displacing time for sleep. There's a phenomenon you might have heard of, revenge bedtime procrastination. Anyone heard of that before? It describes this tendency that we sometimes have. If we've had a very long work day, for example, and we get home at the end of the day and we feel like we want some time back for ourselves, so we take revenge by procrastinating and maybe watching an extra episode or something instead of going to bed. So beware revenge bedtime procrastination. There was an interesting interview with the CEO of Netflix, Reed Hastings, a few years ago, and he argued in this interview that he believes your sleep is his biggest competition. And he's probably got a point. I think I can relate to that. I've got a top tip for you to maybe reduce revenge bedtime procrastination. What happens when you get to the end of your favourite series, an episode on Netflix? Queues up the next one automatically. Even gives you the opportunity to skip the introduction. If you're anything like me and my wife, we tell ourselves the same thing every time. It always ends on a cliffhanger, right? And I'm like, oh, I just want to see what's next. Let's just watch the first 5 minutes just to see if the person's died or not, or whatever it is. Well, we never do. We always watch another episode, and then a bit of the next one, and we've lost another 45 to 50 minutes of sleep. Did you know you can turn off autoplay on Netflix and other streaming platforms? All you need to do is you need to log into the web interface often. You go to settings, and you can manually switch off autoplay. And many people find, myself included, that little bit of friction that's created in that user experience, having to go and manually click on and open up the next episode, can provide just enough time for our rational brain to get in control and help us to make the good decision to go to bed rather than watching whatever episode is next. Once you do get to sleep, make sure your bedroom is as dark as possible. As a rule of thumb, when you're about to go to sleep, if you can see the outline of your hand in front of your face, then your room is too bright. So that means getting blackout curtains. If you can't black the room out, then maybe consider training yourself to use an eye mask to block that light out of your eyes. As I mentioned, try to get 7 hours of sleep at least. In practice, that often means we need to spend a bit more time in bed than that. Conversely, our room at night needs to be really dark. But first thing in the morning, within the first couple of hours, try to get some bright light. It provides a powerful signal to your body clock, which can actually help you to get to sleep later at the end of the day. Make sure your room is as quiet as possible. And then, if you choose to drink alcohol, drink little and stop early. Unfortunately, no amount of alcohol is good for sleep. Alcohol is a very tricky substance. It tricks us into thinking that it helps sleep because it reduces the time it takes us to get to sleep. But unfortunately, that comes at the expense of disrupting the recovery we experience during sleep. And it's a dose-response relationship. The more you drink, the later you stop, the worse your sleep is. Now, that isn't a recommendation to start drinking at breakfast, right? Ideally, we wouldn't drink at all, but if you do choose to drink, drinking less, stopping earlier, will minimize its impact on your sleep. So we talked a lot about sleep, but we can also recover during the workday. But when was the last time that you scheduled some time to switch off during your workday? Very few of us do. About half of knowledge workers rarely or never take breaks during their workday. But the evidence is really clear. Our brain needs a break. Now, I've got a little piece of technology here behind this desk, and it can measure my brain activity in real time, if I can get it to connect and work. So bear with me a moment. I'm going to try and fit it. It's called an EEG headset. It stands for electroencephalogram. And there's 14 sensors on this headset. We call them channels, 14 channels. And it's picking up, once I've switched it on the electrical activity on my scalp. And that electrical activity is coming from the neurons, from the brain cells. And so if it connects, what we're going to be able to see on this next screen, hopefully, is the electrical activity coming from these 14 channels. So there we go. So this is a raw feed from 14 channels, the electrical activity of from my scalp. But what we can do is with this piece of software, I can switch over and using something called a free Fourier transformation, which only mathematicians and statisticians might be familiar with, we can transform those 14 channels of data into 4 brainwave frequencies. And if you're familiar with kind of neurophysiology, you might have heard of these before. But we can see 4 brainwave frequency bands. There's 5 bars because this beta band is split into 2. But the slower end, we've got theta waves. So we generally only see theta waves when we're quite relaxed. Slightly faster, we've got alpha waves. We've got gamma waves, the fastest, which we see with kind of creative ideation. There's quite a lot of noise in this signal at the moment because I'm kind of moving my head around. But most of the time on an average work day, you'd see dominance in this beta band between low beta and high beta. At the slower end of beta, that's associated with being more engaged. At the higher end of beta, that's where generally we start to see people feeling more stressed. It's a biomarker or a signature of stress. We can also take this electrical activity, and the software that I'm using can transform it into quite a nice kind of artistic representation. So this electrical activity, which has been picked up by these 14 channels, has been transformed into this visualization. And what you can see that the slower brainwave frequencies are represented by cooler blue colors. Then the faster, kind of warmer colors that you can see, the kind of reds and oranges, they represent towards that high beta range. And you can actually see different regions of my brain are more active than others. So what do you notice? You see quite a lot of activity in this frontal region. It's kind of kicking off all over the place now, but that front part of my brain, it's called the prefrontal cortex. You can think of it as the control center of the brain. It's particularly active right now, as you'd hope, because I'm focused. It's associated sometimes with executive functions, with sustained attention. You might also see it when you're making decisions or solving complex problems, for example. But we can use this technology to build up a picture of what is going on during the average knowledge worker's workday. And some other researchers have taken these data and used it to measure what is going on. And they've seen some really interesting patterns. So I'm going to flick onto that for a moment. I'll just take off this headset. One of the patterns that they see is that when we don't take breaks between meetings, we see more of this higher beta brainwave activity. And this higher beta brainwave activity is a really strong signal of higher stress. Also, we see something called negative frontal alpha asymmetry. That means lower engagement. So when we don't take a break between meetings, performance is impaired, but well-being is too. What do you see when we do take a break? Well, rather than that higher beta brainwave activity, we see lower beta brainwave activity. And in this case, that's associated with engagement rather than stress. We also see something called positive frontal alpha asymmetry rather than negative frontal alpha asymmetry, which is associated with higher performance. So the simple message to take away from this is that when we take breaks between meetings, it's not just about improving performance, it improves well-being too. Well-being and performance can be complementary with each other rather than in conflict. Now, there's all kinds of principles and lessons we can take away from this, but I'd really encourage you to just try and think of one thing that you might be able to take away. You know, in the average organization, 22% of people exhibit symptoms of burnout. But when people adopt some of these proactive recovery strategies, breaks between meetings, maybe thinking about adequate sleep, those burnout symptoms prevalence drops to just 2%. Not only that, they've observed 26% improvements in performance. You know, it sometimes feels like well-being and performance are in conflict, but I'd argue that they're not. It's actually well-being that is the foundation for sustainable high performance. And we're kind of coming into land now. I know we've got some Q&A, and I'm really looking forward to getting your questions there. But the final thing I wanted to talk about was the importance of destigmatizing failure in the workplace. So very often I mentioned that people worry about making mistakes. And the lesson that I want to share with you as we kind of come to a close is from Formula One. In a Formula One research and development cycle, the average failure rate is about 97%. There's 1,000 design changes a week on average. Now, I recognize that in your environment, a 97% failure rate would not be economically viable. So I don't want to encourage that, certainly. But there is an important lesson that we can take from that. I think that lesson is that even failures have an upside if they're framed as opportunities to learn. And one of the ways that we can create that kind of culture is by fostering psychological safety. But psychological safety doesn't just mean making ourselves comfortable. I think it has to be combined with performance. And in practice, this means we stay in this learning zone, a zone with high performance standards, but also where people feel free to make mistakes, where people feel able to share their ideas. There's several characteristics which characterize teams with high psychological safety. The first is that people feel free to make mistakes. Secondly, they feel able to learn from those mistakes. Thirdly, they can share problems. Fourthly, they can take risks. Fifthly, they can ask for help. Finally, they can support each other, as well as making and feeling valued for their unique contribution. I could go into a huge amount of detail about psychological safety and how to build it. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that today. But if you reflect on all the things that we've covered in this last 45 minutes or so, I hope that you can find maybe one idea you can take away that might be able to help you to become more decisive and focused. To maybe be a bit more proactive and resistant to procrastination, to feel empowered to act and perhaps not so fearful, perhaps framing those failures as opportunities to learn. You can boost your bias for action. I think that could begin by scheduling some high cognitive gear time to focus on your highest priority, most impactful work, perhaps in that peak period of your day. Then it could be involving spending some time in low cognitive gear, maybe some time for proactive recovery, taking a step back so you can step forward further. Finally, we're never going to be able to get rid of time in cognitive middle gear, but could you reduce it? Perhaps apply some of those tips to get rid of unnecessary meetings, streamline your calendar, improve your communication efficiency. I've shared a ton of ideas today. Hopefully some of them might be useful, but I'd encourage you to use a filter, a question which Frank Williams, the founder of the Williams F1 team, encouraged people to consider when they presented a new idea for him. I know the Williams team hasn't had so much success in recent years, but over the history of that company, they've actually won 16 Formula One World Championships. When Frank was alive and people came to him with a new idea, he'd always ask them the same question: how will it make the car go faster? Obviously, this question is metaphorical, but if you think about taking one of the ideas that I've shared with you today and applying it to your life and work, what does going faster for you mean? Does it mean a performance improvement? Does it mean creating space to spend a bit more time with friends and families? Does it mean being able to invest in that project where you know you can make a really big difference? I'd encourage you to maybe consider just one idea, one thing that you could take away and apply today. Because I believe that as a company, you've got such great tools and resources available to you. You are ready. Now is the time. You're like that driver behind the wheel, waiting for those 5 lights to go out. But don't wait, because tomorrow starts today. Thank you.